Okay. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Kathy Pfister. I'm the co-coordinator of Amnesty International Group 137 here in San Diego. And this event is titled Regulating the Torture Trade. And it is one of our occasional virtual events on specific topics of interest. And we are lucky enough to have a guest speaker with us tonight, whom we'll introduce in a little bit. So Amnesty, if you're not aware, I think pretty much everyone on this call has come to our meetings, but we meet in person once a month on the second Saturday at 3 o'clock at Mazara's Trattoria in South Park. It's South Park. So if you haven't come, we'd be happy to have you. We write actions. We write letters on urgent actions, and we discuss our future plans. So, okay, well, to start out, as you guys know, we usually have a background video, and so I've spliced together a couple of videos related to the topic. So one is just an intro video on torture. It just defines torture and talks a little bit about the specifics about ending torture. It's about 5 minutes, a little over 5 minutes. And then there's a very short video from Amnesty International on well, it's not from Amnesty International, I guess it's about Amnesty International. They released a report on police abuse of projectiles entitled My Eye Exploded. I think that was earlier this year, and I believe Nate will be discussing that report. It just talks a little bit about that. And then after that, I'll introduce Nate, and he will give his presentation, and then we have one action to do also on, I think, the police, the trade of police equipment that's often used abusively. And then we can ask Nate questions. So I'm going to go ahead and try to start the video. Let me know if you cannot hear it. You should be able to make it full screen on your side if you prefer that. So I'm going to share this with Zoom's special video functionality. I can find it. There it is. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start. Let me know. Speak up if you can't hear it.
Torture is one of the most serious crimes that can be committed against a human being. It aims to dehumanize through calculated acts of cruelty, to remove victims' dignity, and to leave them powerless. It often leaves scars for a lifetime. This is why in 1984, the Convention Against Torture was adopted. It aims to prevent torture and other acts of cruel, inhuman, and degrading punishment around the world. Since then, the absolute prohibition against torture has become accepted as a peremptory norm of international law. This means that all states, regardless of whether they ratified the convention or other relevant treaties that ban the practice, are bound by the prohibition of torture and ill treatment. The right to be free from torture is absolute and can't be set aside. It can't ever be justified on any grounds, in any circumstances, even in times of war. 4 elements are essential to establish torture as defined by the Convention Against Torture. The conduct must cause severe pain or suffering, physical or mental. The conduct must be inflicted intentionally. The torture must be inflicted for a specific purpose. There needs to be the involvement of a state official in some way. Torture can be committed both through an act or an omission. Thus, a state's failure to respond to the basic needs of its prisoners for a prolonged period of time can amount to torture. For example, the case of SLV, Venezuela in Latin America, concerns the lack of proper medical care for the diabetic condition of a prisoner, which eventually resulted in the death of the victim. The infliction of severe mental harm can also constitute torture. Such acts include sleep deprivation, constant threats of rape or harm, or forcing the victim to witness a loved one being tortured. Similarly, enforced disappearances, which can inflict severe suffering on the disappeared persons, as well as on those close to the victim, can also amount to torture. While there is a requirement for torture to be inflicted for a specific purpose, this has been interpreted widely. Some of the purposes that have been recognized include to produce a confession, as a form of punishment, to intimidate the population, to humiliate the victim, or to discriminate. Azul Rojas Marin, who is a transgender person, was arbitrarily arrested by police officers in Peru. She was raped, beaten, and verbally abused due to her sexual orientation. The Inter-American Court found that she had been tortured for a discriminatory purpose, which could be derived from the circumstances surrounding her treatment. In most cases, torture occurs when individuals find themselves in a situation of complete dependency, when they are held in police custody, prison, healthcare facilities, or deprived of their liberty in other contexts. Sometimes, if the context is highly coercive or there is a distinct imbalance of power, the prohibited purpose can be implied. For example, the suggestion that a rape that takes place in a prison happened for simple private sexual gratification purposes has not been accepted. Under the Convention, torture requires the involvement of a state official, at least by acquiescence. This will usually include officials exercising public security functions, such as police, military, prison or detention authorities. But it can also involve other officials who exercise control over individuals, such as mental health facility administrators, teaching staff, or officials at centres holding asylum seekers or refugees, persons holding de facto power as public officials, or private contractors carrying out governance functions. States are also responsible for tolerating acts of private actors, for instance in situations of domestic violence. The key obligation of states under the Convention Against Torture are not to torture ever, to protect from torture and prevent it, to prosecute and punish torturers, to afford reparations to victims, not to send someone to a country where they are likely to face torture, not to admit evidence obtained by torture as evidence in legal proceedings. To prevent torture, states can adopt certain measures, including training of law enforcement and prison personnel, and introducing independent monitoring mechanisms. Victims of torture have a right to a remedy and adequate reparation. Given the long-lasting consequences often left by torture, beyond the physical and the mental harm, survivors can obtain different forms of reparations which go beyond compensation to address their different needs. Visit redress.org/resources/training to learn more.
So there's a little bit of a play on words.
Somebody
People, I don't think
mute themselves. There's
Amnesty
some
International
background noise.
published a new report on Tuesday in which it denounced the increasingly widespread use of riot weapons such as rubber and plastic bullets by police around the world. Amnesty has joined up with 30 other organisations to call for the signing of an international treaty against the use of what it calls instruments of torture. In the report, Amnesty International's Patrick Wilkins said the manufacture and trade of weapons, known as kinetic impact projectiles, rubber and plastic bullets, need to be controlled to combat what he called an escalating cycle of abuse. The report is the result of 5 years of research in tens of countries and reveals that thousands of protesters and bystanders have been injured and dozens killed as a result of the use of these weapons. In France, for example, nearly 2,500 protesters were injured at the height of the Yellow Vest protests. 440 eye injuries have been recorded in Chile since protests against inequality began in 2019. But Amnesty International says the real numbers are probably much higher.
Okay. So hopefully everyone was able to see and hear that okay. Let me bring up the introduction. So we are really excited to have with us today Nate Smith. Some of you attended the workshop he gave at the AGM here in San Diego earlier, whenever it was, last spring, I guess, on the torture trade. And I know several people from our group attended and thought it was a really interesting and important workshop. So Nate is co-chair of Amnesty International USA's Military, Security, and Police Co-Group, a group of volunteer experts focusing on policy and advocacy relating to the arms trade and use of force. He attended arms trade treaty negotiations as the AIUSA representative on the global AI delegation in both the July 2012 and March 2013 conferences. He was also part of AIUSA's Human Rights Observer Delegation to Ferguson, Missouri in August 2014 and to Baltimore, Maryland in 2015. Nate holds a Master of Public Policy from the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan, where he specialized in human rights, international policy, and quantitative analysis. He has been an Amnesty International activist since 2011. So welcome, Nate.
Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for inviting me to your meeting. Can everyone hear me okay? Great, awesome. Well, yeah, as you can see, it's very dark here. I'm in the woods of Maine, actually, right now. So the other side of the country from you. You may hear in the background some loons or an owl here and there, but hopefully that just keeps things interesting. Today, what I plan to do is essentially take you, well, quite literally take you through the slide deck that we had at the AGM. I started to try to edit it down and I just didn't want to. I wanted to show you everything. But I'll be taking you through it with kind of a little bit more of a 10,000 foot view, because I am neither Michael Crowley nor Verity Coyle, who are my two experts on that panel. And so, as we go through the information in the slide deck, I'm going to do my best to give you the general gist of kind of the important points of what we're working on. But when you have some specific questions, I'm going to write those all down and try to kind of coalesce and get some answers for you from the actual experts themselves. So forgive me if I just pass some of those on to the folks that know this process better than I do. If it's okay with you all, I will share my screen here and I will bring up the presentation. Just a moment. Okay. So what we see here is, the same slide deck that we presented at the AGM. And like I said, I'm going to take you through, the basic structure. But first, I kind of want to set the scene for you. What we're trying to do here is get the U.S. government to support the creation of a body in the UN to establish a treaty that regulates the trade in items that can be used for torture. So I just want to make that just, very obvious, bottom line up front, kind of clear. That's the goal. And what I'm going to show you will span the spectrum from kind of items that are only used for torture. And so here you can think about things like thumb screws or, kind of other awful items that, their only use is torture. To some other items that are more familiar as kind of crowd control, riot control type of items. So you'll think of like, as we saw in the video, projectiles, tear gas. We're also going to look at kind of stun guns, things like that. These are items which are kind of dual use in the sense that when they're used, in their proper way, it's legal, but when they're used on, for example, a previously restrained person, it's torture. And so you can kind of see the abuse of items like that and the unregulated trade in items like that is what gives a rise to the effort that we're undertaking right now. So that's kind of setting the stage for you all. Some of these slides I'll probably go through pretty quickly, just because the content of the slide is essentially a photo of some torture equipment, and I don't have the technical knowledge that Dr. Crowley has about, how these individual items work, in specific. But again, please feel free to type some questions in the chat or share them, with your group leaders, and I'll, like I said, I'll get to the experts and try to respond to them as best we can. So just, looking ahead at what we're going to cover, like I said, I'm going to be summarizing what these experts were talking about. Dr. Michael Crowley was from the Omega Research Foundation. They do a lot of research on how these items are, traded around the world and abused. And then Verity, who's a International Secretariat employee, she, is knee deep in the treaty process stuff. So, and she's helping shepherd the global network. So I'll skip over. This is a little bit of background of Omega, a bunch of reports that they have done. This, though, the kind of first on topic slide here, I want to take a second to talk about this. This is a big business. The trade in items like this involves quite a lot of money. It involves a lot of corporations that have a lot of money for lobbying. That's the difference between the forces in this country, anyway, that are in favor of this trade and just increasing it no matter what, and folks who care about what's happening to the recipients, kind of on the other end of some of these items. So this is, footage of a recent trade conference for these items. But just, it's very clearly very busy. I like our AGMs more though. Omega has done, they typically, they very often pair with Amnesty International on research. And so what we'll do is get into some of these items here. On the left, you can see kind of body armor, baton and shield kits. On the right, you can see some restraint shackles. In this next slide, on the left, you can see grenades that are used in riot control. And on the right, there's some other tear gas canisters. The next section of items is on restraints and kind of other law enforcement equipment. What you'll see are some different types of restraint devices. What this is a shock belt that will, as prisoners will be, or the victims will be ordered to wear, and it'll, they'll be able to remotely shock them. Similarly, these are vests and other items that can be worn for the same purpose. Here we have shock batons as well. And again, what you're seeing here is in that penumbra of items that, theoretically have some kind of legitimate law enforcement purpose. That's, of course, something else to be debated, but also when used on a restrained victim, these are torture devices. Classic taser, stun gun type of thing. stun gloves. Some of these things I didn't even know existed until I saw this presentation, to be honest. Kind of grabbing claw type of things. These stun guns that shoot out electrodes attached to wires. And then we have things like thumb cuffs, shackles, inquest chairs, other types of shackles against kind of walls, over the head shackles, police batons, whatever this thing is. Some of these items I've just never even seen before, but we've only been introduced to them recently. These are spiked shields. The use of tear gas, similarly, when used in situations in enclosed areas, a tactic that police units often refer to as kettling. Tear gas can be lethal. It can displace oxygen and kill people. Certain types of drones that have been used to deploy some of these items. Tactics that involve hog tying, like you see here, that put the body in a stress position, or other types of tactics that restrict the airflow. The baton in his hand is, another item that we're talking about that doesn't currently have international control. We've got an explainer video here that I actually think we've already seen. Let me push play on this to see if I think it might be new. I'll pause right there. Can everyone hear sound?
No, did you share computer sound?
Hang on, I'll do that. Just a sec. Okay.
Torture can look like this, or it can look like this. It can look like this, but it can also look like this. Tools of torture can look like this, but they can also look like this. Throughout the world, police and security forces are responding to public demonstrations with violence, inflicting cruel, inhuman, and degrading acts on peaceful protesters using tools classified as standard policing equipment or less lethal. While this gear can play a legitimate role in law enforcement, it can also cause grave injury, especially when used abusively against protesters. The ill treatment of individuals when asserting their right to peacefully protest stands in violation of treaties signed by almost every country in the world. Yet there is no global regulation on the trade in these tools of torture, allowing manufacturers to make millions while people suffer around the world. What can be done to stop this pandemic of abuse?
Amnesty has been working to stop torture since our organisation began. We now want to focus on the torture trade. There are two types of equipment that we're concerned about. One is inherently abusive, has no other purpose than to torture and ill-treat people, and this should be banned. The second type does serve a legitimate function when properly used. Unfortunately, our research around the world shows that routinely it is misused to commit torture and other ill treatment. Therefore, we need global regulation of the torture trade.
On December 10, 1984, the United Nations General Assembly's Resolution 3946 adopted the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, which requires its state parties to prevent acts of torture and other ill treatment in any territory under its jurisdiction. It makes no exception for internal political instability or any other public emergency. Yet almost 40 years later, authorities routinely violate the treaty when confronting protesters as they march for equality, human rights, economic justice, or the future of our planet. Over the past decade, at least 4,800 protesters have been killed as they face a literal barrage of violent and repressive crowd control methods that meet the definition of torture or other ill treatment, yet are still widely practiced. These tactics not only cause grave injury to peaceful protesters, they also have a chilling effect on protest movements as a whole, undermining the positive effects of protests and preventing the people most discriminated against from having a voice. In 2020, scenes of police using excessive tear gas outside the White House shocked the world. But that was only one example of a chemical irritant being used against protesters. French police recklessly deployed tear gas against protesters in September of 2019. That same year, tear gas grenades manufactured by French companies Nobel Sport Sécurité and Alcetex were used abusively against protesters in Lebanon as they marched against widespread corruption. The burning and swelling caused by tear gas isn't the only threat. The canisters themselves pose a danger to the public when fired as projectiles into the crowd. Protesters in Sudan have been directly struck by tear gas grenades made in Brazil. And a woman in Colombia was severely injured when American-made tear gas canisters were fired at low angles during protests that have resulted in an estimated 87 deaths.
These canisters are projectiles. So when they're fired, again, it's into an indiscriminate group of people. They're really hard to direct, impossible to direct, in fact. And so when they hit people, especially in their face or their head, their delicate parts of their neck, that's when you see blunt trauma and death.
In addition to large tear gas projectiles, protesters today also face rubber bullets that are often fired indiscriminately into crowds, sometimes with horrific results.
My son's face is completely disfigured. My son has splinters. They have ruined his life.
Amnesty International has documented the abusive use of rubber bullets against protesters in over 30 states or territories in all regions of the world. Rubber bullets, chemical irritants, and even handheld batons can become tools of torture and other ill treatment when deployed unlawfully against individuals. Without trade controls, these goods often end up in the hands of abusive police forces who use them in crackdowns on peaceful protests. That is why Amnesty International is calling on states to agree to a legally binding global treaty to control the torture trade and protect peaceful protesters. The Torture-Free Trade Treaty should establish strong international standards for the trade in law enforcement tools with a total ban on inherently abusive equipment, including spike batons and shields, certain electric shock devices, and restraints, such as leg irons and wall, thumb, and finger cuffs. The treaty should also call for human rights-based controls on tools that law enforcement officials ordinarily have access to. Protest has played a vital role in making sure our human rights are acknowledged by institutions with power. Until these tools of torture are regulated, protesters will continue to face violent repression that undermines these fundamental rights.
Okay. Can everyone hear me okay? So I think one of the things I like a lot about that video is that it helps to draw that connection between these items that a lot of folks think of as kind of traditional police equipment and riot control equipment, and the horrible things that can happen when they're misused and used on people who are already restrained, and used against peaceful protesters. What you'll see here are a handful of kind of the images and messages that Amnesty has been putting out on this topic. We see examples from, France, Iran, just all over the place. Colombia, Belarus, Thailand, and yet there's no international instrument, and so that's kind of what we're really focused on here. There's been a long timeline. I'm not going to dwell on this slide because there's a lot of really small text, but I will send around a link to the slide deck so that you all can peruse this at your leisure, because you know, it's not super easy to read on the screen here. So there is a couple of different bodies that I want you all to know about that are you know, part of this. One of them is the Alliance for Torture-Free Trade. This is an alliance of countries. This is a UN bloc. This list that you see here, I think, is constantly changing. I know they're constantly trying to recruit states. I think they recently got the Gambia as a co-chair, but don't quote me on that. You know, the point of this is that it's very popular at the UN. It's got a lot of support, and this is kind of the core group, what you'll see here. That's that group on the left that we just saw, the Alliance for Torture-Free Trade. There's vocal opponents, including Singapore, Egypt, China, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Israel, and then there's the kind of fence sitters. You'll notice the USA is among these to be influenced countries. That's why I'm talking to you right now. That's why we're focused on it. You know, as you probably understand already, the US is also, you know, a big decider in the international community. A lot of other states will go along with what the US decides to do for a lot of reasons that are more important than whatever the actual topic at hand is. Again, this is a slide that is current as of like March. This is constantly changing, and this landscape is going to change. One of the things I'm going to ask the folks on this call to do, if you feel so inclined, is to sign up for our email list, so we can send you, you know, we don't mail more than once or twice a month, and what we do is either actions or kind of background information. You know, this is, again, current as of March. A lot more has happened at the UN since then. But I want to stop there and see if folks have questions.
Anybody have a question? The question I have is, can people, like, you know, during Black Lives Matter protests, when a lot of the police were incredibly abusive, and Amnesty documented a lot of that, what recourse do the individuals harmed by that have? Can they sue, or are the police completely protected from such things?
That's a great question. My understanding is that a lot of protesters have had success in the courts with police abuse and claims of police abuse. What we see, you know, a lot of times is police departments where quite a lot of budget, quite a lot of taxpayer money is used on settlements for these cases. You know, so they won't often go to trial. Usually they'll settle, they'll fire the cops sometimes, and then those cops will go to the next town over and get employment. So, you know, one of the issues is that they just pay more money to settle rather than ever actually face real accountability. But that's not always true. There are definitely cases where you know, officers, other individuals who've displayed use of force that is kind of disproportionate like that have been held accountable. So it's a little bit of a crapshoot, unfortunately. But you know, that is, I just want to be clear, like that's part of the impetus here is use of force stuff, in addition to the kind of restrained torture type of stuff. So I'm really glad you brought that up. Bill, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Nate, and thanks for the presentation. It's very informative. My question is on the intersection between torture trade and peaceful assembly. Clearly, many of the examples you gave are examples of peaceful assembly being disrupted. And so I'm wondering how much that has, I mean, if you could talk about that intersection, but then also how much has that played a role in your coalition building? I mean, there's NGOs that focus just on freedom of speech and peaceful assembly around the globe. There's the UN Special Rapporteur on peaceful assembly, who I think would be very interested in this issue. There's groups like that came out of Standing Rock that were, brutalized by, these weapons, and now they're kind of fighting for peaceful assembly, passage in different legislatures. So I'm just wondering, what the intersection is between those two issues. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, and that's a little bit of a bridge from what Kathy was just talking about. But this is something I've been wanting to pursue. I've in the past 6 months or so kind of found myself the convener of a bi-weekly call with the kind of US NGOs that are focused on promoting this effort towards a torture-free trade. And they're very focused on the torture side of things. So it's like Center for Victims of Torture, Physicians for Human Rights, ACLU. But what we haven't really gotten into is some of the groups that you're talking about, Bill, some of the Protect the Protest type of groups. And obviously Protect the Protest is a big Amnesty flagship campaign. And so I'm glad you isolated this, because I would like to draw on some of the interest and momentum around that effort to kind of siphon a little bit of that into this international effort to restrict the trade in these items. It's not, obviously there's a huge fight with a lot of different dimensions and a lot of different kind of fronts, many of which have nothing to do with the international trade in, these specific tools or whatever. But I think it is a big part of it. Like, some of these countries where the worst abuses happen, they import these items from, friggin', Pennsylvania, So it's not the main front even, I don't think, in what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. But I would love to pull a little bit of the momentum, because I think it's important. But I think the way you describe it is exactly right. Like, there's a big coalition out there and a lot of folks who are interested in, and I'd love for some of them to recognize the important role that the US plays in, not just doing these abuses in its borders, but also exporting the tools that we use here to other countries that do the same kind of thing.
Yeah, and so, I mean too, in the US, the people protesting against the critical infrastructure laws in different states, I think they would be really into this. But also internationally, anybody working with human rights defenders seems like that would be a natural, right? Because human rights defenders are the ones who are often the victims of these tools. And I'm thinking of like International Society for Human Rights, does such great work on human rights defenders. And then also like national human rights institutes. Every country's got one, except the US. And, and even networks of human rights institutes. I mean, people I know would be really into this, and because they're the people being brutalized, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's an awesome flag. It's what you're pinpointing, one of the things that is on my list for the next call for our kind of US-based NGO coalition in support of this, which is expanding our network. And I think this is one of the main directions we need to be doing it. I'm going to take this moment. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I'll put my email in the chat if you want to brainstorm about it.
Well, I got a little message ready to send you. There we go. We got a little email action network set up for our group. I don't have a slick email sign up form here, But that's our official AIUSA.org email. So if you feel comfortable sending your email, just send an email to that, and I'll go in there and add you to our little list. And like I said, I promise not to spam you or anything like that. But that's a great way to get in touch. Okay, great. And I got yours, Bill. Thank you. I'll just put that. I got a little node stock.
So so I know there's been a movement to stop the militarization of police, and you know, that they were getting these, but you know, military weapons very cheap because the US military, you know, had so much extra apparently. So are they one of your partners in this? Because I'm assuming there's a correlation between the militarization of police and some of these abuses, since they have more equipment that enables them to be abusive.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because that's actually, it's adjacent but entirely additional kind of work stream that we have in my military security and police group. And so, you know, one of the things we've worked on quite a lot is, so the program you're talking about is called the 1033 program, which is kind of excess military equipment being provided at no cost to local law enforcement agencies. But there's an adjacent program called the 1122 program, which is similar, but the law enforcement agencies purchase at a discount the equipment. That's the only difference. But it's similarly opaque with respect to public record keeping. And as far as I know, does not have any kind of human rights vetting like we would have for provisioning similar equipment abroad, security partners, for example. So it is a big area of work for us. I will actually say that we had a co-group member, a member of my little group here, that was an expert in this exact field, who then left the co-group because her own organization that she started got a grant to work on these issues. So it's a great it's a great reason to lose somebody, because she's continuing the work with actual money behind her. And she's wonderful. Her organization is called Women's for Weapons Trade Transparency. And she's, you know, she wrote our recent blog post on the 1122 program, which was prior to her organization's FOIA requests, barely known about. But this is a big issue in this exact area. Like, you know, often, you know, we will look at the US as a pretty good model with export controls. You know, we do have export controls on crime control equipment. They're not as strong as we would like them to be, and I would love for them to be universal or international laws. But, you know, they do exist. But internally, with these programs that you're talking about, those same controls don't really exist. They'll sell these things to any police department, as far as we know. So, you know, I'm really glad you brought that up.
Just in the US or anywhere in the world?
Well, the programs that I'm referring to, the 1033 and 1122 programs, are just for local law enforcement in the US.
Yeah, okay.
But the kind of broader question of crowd control equipment being sold abroad is the subject of this exact presentation. You know, that's the parallel I'm trying to draw is, you know, it's not that, you know, people abroad matter as well, you know, their rights matter too, just like here in the US. And so, you know, having some kind of regulation around these dangerous items is important, just as important in programs like domestically, the 1033 program, as it would be, you know, abroad. And we'd like to see controls in both places.
And are there a lot of US-based corporations that are selling this, either the inherently abusive tools or the dual purpose that are often used abusively?
As far as we're able to tell, in the inherently abusive category, that's actually, as far as we're able to discern, that is prohibited in the Commerce control list. It's, I believe, controlled under category 0, which is presumption of denial, which are instruments that are specifically designed for torture. Now, I say that because that's what, you know, our interpretation is, reading the actual policy and the actual law. However, we've not received any confirmation from any officials that we've asked about this one way or the other. My understanding though is that that is a closed window in U.S. law anyway.
So
we would love to see that in an international instrument, but as far as I know, it doesn't quite exist yet.
So the law bans export of those devices, but does it ban the manufacture of them? Can they be sold? Are they also banned?
The law I'm referring to only concerns exports. I don't know what the law says about manufacture at all.
So they can make thumb screws for domestic purposes, but not export. Like,
live free or die, Kathy. I'm not sure. To be totally candid, I don't actually know the answer to that question.
Okay.
I think if we did some Googling to try to buy some thumb screws on the internet, we could probably do it.
Oh yeah, eBay.
But as far as the specific legal answer for you, I'm sorry. I don't actually know.
So you don't target any specific corporations. You're working at a government kind of state level to try to come up with a treaty.
Yeah, so what we're doing, what my group is focused on is organizing an effort to influence the US government to support the establishment of a treaty at the international level.
Yeah.
However, there's another coordination group called the Business and Human Rights Group that does do what you're alluding to, which does kind of pressure corporations. They used to, I don't know if they still do this, but they used to like buy stock and attend shareholder meetings. But they do the kind of corporation-based activism that you're talking about. So it's not our lane, but there are other volunteers that are kind of parallel to me, similar kind of role, that are focused on that type of activism. And
So
I'd be happy to drop some contact info if you're interested.
So you can't name names of any corporations that are.
Oh, well, I mean, Taser International, makes the tasers.
What are they called? Taser International?
I believe so. Although actually, I think they're called Apex now or something like that. If you're interested, I could do a little collection of some corporations that are selling these items. That would be
interesting. And maybe send it to Becky, and she can send it to me, and I can send. Oh, Bill says Taser is an Arizona-based company.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah, so any information you can send it, either you can send it to our group email or to Becky and she can get it to us. Our group email is group137@amnestysd.org. Yeah, and any kind of information like that, and we can also include the email to sign up for the email list.
Great. Yeah, I'll definitely send a follow-up. I'm just taking some notes over in another Google Doc right now, but I'll send a follow-up email with some info. The link I just put in the Zoom chat here is what is currently the owner of Taser International. They're called Axon. But yeah, no, I mean, I'm very happy to name names. There are other experts that I could refer to you that could do a better job of naming names.
And so, let's see, Tony has his hand up.
Yeah, go ahead, Tony.
Is there any legislation being proposed or any champions, politicians?
There is not legislation that I've seen, although that is specifically directed at this. Our goal right now, as far as lobbying, is not legislation, but executive level foreign policy apparatus kind of support at the UN for the formation of a treaty. So I don't have legislation to point you to. What I will have to point you to is going to be this fall and then going into the winter. Amnesty USA is going to make, ideally, I hope, a campaign about it. I've been pushing them, if not at least a spotlight kind of on this issue. because there are going to be some decisions at the UN that we would really like the US delegation to shift from neutral to support. So yeah, that's the best I got for you. There is no legislation though that I can point you to. However, on similar topics, there is legislation, and if you sign up for our little listserv here, you'll get some background and then some action items on that as well, for similar things.
And related to that subject matter, is there anything that could be done, like put it on the Democratic plank for 2024 election? You know.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, because that's a document we've just been putting final edits together with Amnesty USA staff. Is essentially kind of a human rights platform for candidates. Not, we are not partisan. It's open to Democrats and Republicans. We can all view the political landscape how we will view it, but we don't prefer Democrats or Republicans, strictly speaking. However, we have been putting together what we hope is a good kind of summary of commitments to human rights policies that we think we could ask candidates for. And so part of it is a commitment to supporting the establishment of a torture-free trade treaty. I will have to get, sorry, go ahead.
Why not approach Republicans, Democrats, Green Party, and say, here is our human rights wish list, and would you support that?
I mean, I think I don't work in the government relations office, but my understanding is that's what they do. They don't prefer one party or the other. They ask for meetings with everybody. More meetings might occur on one side or the other, but we are not, as far as I understand their operations, it is not 100% nonpartisan. Receptiveness varies depending on your party, but yeah, it's part of it. And obviously a document like that, don't quote me on whether or not torture-free trade treaty language is going to be included in that platform explicitly, because it's still going through edits and there are a lot of other competing interests and stuff. But I'm glad you brought that up, because that's something we're talking about right now with the government relations folks.
So any other questions? Amnesty's been working on torture, to try to abolish torture for pretty much as long as they've been in existence, I think. So what, 60 years or something? So it seems like this is a sort of a shift in tactics. So it used to be that they would try to get governments and, their police or whatever to stop torturing. So they would go right to the sources. And apparently it's not particularly successful. So this is another tactic, another tack you're taking to try to deprive those would-be torturers of the instruments of torture, because you can't convince them directly not to torture.
I would describe it more of a yes and kind of a situation. There is still definitely fighting on that front. It's just that, volunteers, like the folks in my group like to kind of try to expand the tool set a little bit by providing a little bit of extra angles that they might not be able to fund, experts for on staff. So, it's not displacing, what you described, direct pressure on governments to stop doing this stuff. It's just another angle of attack to try to prevent this stuff.
Do you work with other organizations like Human Rights Watch, the Center for Victims of Torture?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I lead a call every 2 weeks, and one of the primary participants is the Center for Victims of Torture. And there's folks from Physicians for Human Rights, there's folks from ACLU, and one thing that is the top of our agenda in September is expanding that, and we have targets on staff at Human Rights Watch that we want to try to get involved as well.
Any other questions?
So what do you want local groups to do? How to help?
Yeah, so the what we're going to ask you to do is contact various officials, either your local representatives or folks, in the executive branch, and ask them to support the establishment of a torture-free trade treaty. That's not an immediate call to action because we're in the doldrums of August right now, and kind of not much is happening. But that's what you would look forward to. I sent the link. You should sign up for our email, and I'll make sure that you all have my contact info. If you lose that address or whatever, you can always email me. But the short answer is more to come. We're in the middle of summer now, and what we're trying to do is give everybody this type of background to say, like, here's some education on the issue. Here's why we think it's important. And the action time is this fall going into the winter, aiming toward what we think is going to be some January action at the UN. So building support for that slowly over the next 6-9 months or whatever.
So I think before 9/11, the US was pretty well situated in the anti-torture camp. But since 9/11 and all that, that came about where people decided torture was a great thing, whatever. So okay, so you show that the US is not they're not a member of this torture-free trade group that's trying to come up with this treaty, but they're not a vocal opponent like some countries. So where do you think the Biden administration stands? I'm sure Trump would have opposed it, but shouldn't Biden be fairly sympathetic?
I would hope so. My understanding from, I'm not sure it's on their radar yet, to be honest. I don't think it's a front burner issue for them.
Yeah.
So that's why I think they're in the to be influenced column. From the meetings we've had, I haven't been at them. Members of the group that I convene have been at them, but they're receptive. They're not rejecting it. So they're movable, but yeah, I just don't think I think it's simply not a front burner issue for them.
Yeah.
That's the thing. Not a lot of folks know about this effort. But like I said, I think Amnesty, the kind of global secretary is planning to pull together a decent campaign around it this fall.
So it hasn't come to a vote at the UN yet.
I mean, there have been various procedural votes and things like that. And I guess for details on that, I'd relay kind of detailed questions to Verity. But no major votes have. I think the next major vote is in the January timeframe.
But I guess it's not that oh well, if a majority votes for it at the UN, then it becomes law. But it's just whoever signs the treaty is bound to it. Is that how it goes?
Well, the Convention Against Torture, is one of these preemptory treaties that even if you're not a party to it, it's, binding in international law. Again, the usual grain of salt that comes with anything international law related.
Yeah.
It's not always the case that that's super enforceable. However, it's better than nothing. It's not unimportant.
Yeah.
So
it shines a spotlight on it and puts pressure on people, at least.
Exactly. At the very least, exactly. Yeah.
People don't like to be embarrassed on the international stage.
Right. So as far as the specific answers to your questions, that would depend on what was negotiated and what the language is like.
The problem is the countries that are likely to sign this treaty are the ones that probably aren't that involved in torture to begin with, and the ones that won't sign it are the torturers.
Yeah, but that's not a sharp line. And the US has a lot of influence over a lot of countries that are in that kind of penumbra of, sometimes they do shit like this. And if we can pressure them to sign, or sometimes they export stuff like this. And, if we can influence them to commit to this, that's a good thing. It's not 100%. It's not a guarantee, of course. And as is anything in this realm, right? But it's better than not doing it. And of course, all of these folks, remember that slide I put up at the very beginning, that trade show of all the people that make a ton of money exporting these items that are then used to repress protests and torture political prisoners. They're all paid tons of money to convince politicians to not agree to treaties like this. And it's the folks like the people who are spending their Wednesday evening on calls like this that are opposing them. So, they would love for us to think that it's all pointless and that, there's no real accountability and blah, blah, blah. They would love it if we shut the hell up.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's always good to call attention to things. Make people comfortable. Okay, so I posted in the chat a link to a petition on regulating the trade in policing equipment. I don't know how long this has been up there, but it's one of those ones. So if you click on that link, at least it worked for me. It actually took me there. Sometimes it doesn't. You just put your first name, last name, and email and country, and then click the take action. And I guess they're sending, this is to go to heads of state, asking them to support the torture-free trade treaty. So does everybody see that in the chat? And if you've done one of these before, I think it like autofills everything in. Anyone need help doing the action?
Nate, I want to thank you for your alternative programming to the Republican debates and to Trump.
That's right. I forgot that was. I'm sorry, I kept you all from that.
I think we are close in number of attendees.
and likelihood to become president.
Well, I tell ya, if Republicans win, we won't be signing no torture treaty. I'm afraid.
Yeah, well, we also won't be shutting up.
Yeah, that's the time to become even more obnoxious.
That's right. Well, I really thank you all so much for letting me present at your meeting here. It means a lot. This is something I work on, and not a lot of folks take the time to think about stuff like this. So it's it means a lot that folks are taking time out of their evening to think about some frankly kind of unpleasant and hopeless sounding stuff, but stuff that we should care about. So thank you all very much.
Okay, well, if there are no more last minute questions, I guess we can wrap it up. Okay, thanks, Nate.
Thank you all.
Bye,
Take care.
everybody.
Bye.
Let's see.